Hi there, my name's Gordon and I'm here to read another portion from my book entitled The End is Nigh Again, but this time we really mean it. And it's a book about Jehovah's Witnesses and my experiences of being a Jehovah's Witness. The portion I'm going to read today is from chapter 2 called Sex, Sin and Self-Abuse. And what it's about is this: like all religions, organised religions that I'm aware of, the idea of sex and sexual drive and sexual urges is labelled sinful. Now, it's a bizarre thing because anyone who's been through teenage years will know that sexual drives have nothing to do with the conscious mind. In fact, your sexual drive comes from within. It's almost beyond your control. Well, in fact, it is beyond your control. So actually to label that as bad and to label the urges that teenagers have as they sort of go through puberty as sinful is bizarre. After all, if there was a God and God had created us, He created us with those urges. And so why we should deny them is bizarre. So, I'm going to read a portion of the book which describes the release of a book called the Youth Book, which is one of the Society's publications which give the youth suggestions on how they were to maintain their lack of sexuality. Okay, so here we go. Another useless suggestion from the Youth Book was to reduce our desires by reading passages from the Bible. Now, here I had to emphatically disagree. The truth was that during the many boring hours I spent at the hall, Mike and I would often play a game of searching through the Bible's index for pornography. Believe it or not, there's a ton of it. We discovered, much to our surprise, that the Old Testament was the most misogynistic and sexually graphic book available to youngsters at the time. There's one particularly memorable passage that recounts the story of two angels that were sent to warn Lot of God's forthcoming destruction of his hometown, the infamous city of Sodom and Gomorrah. According to the story, the city had become a hotbed of sexual malpractice, in which the people were spending most of their day having sex with each other, and failing that, with any nearby animals. Upon arriving, rather than appearing directly in Lot's front room as one would imagine angels to do, the pair chose to transform themselves into humans, somewhere outside the city walls. From there they made their way through the narrow streets to Lot's house. In those days, satellite navigation systems hadn't been invented, and so in their attempt to find the right door, the angels began to ask passers-by. Now, as we've seen in multiple movies, when angels take human form, they're always very beautiful, if a little ambiguous of gender. Given the heightened state of sexual arousal in the city, the sudden presence of what were in effect two ladyboys was ill-advised, to say the least. According to the scriptures, a crowd of men, women and stray dogs began following them as they made their way through the narrow streets to Lot's house. As they continued on, they began to receive more and more attention, along with multiple offers of fantastic sex from the pursuing group. Finally, when it looked like they were about to be set upon, they found the right door and slipped into Lot's house, saving their self-righteousness just in the nick of time. Not to be deterred, however, the lust-filled crowd began to bang loudly on the door, shouting to Lot to send out the two gorgeous drag queens so that everyone could have sex together. Despite Lot's intense desire to hear what the angels had to tell him, he was very conscious that the door to his house wouldn't hold for long against the rampant masses. He knew only too well that when the crowd finally broke through, he, the angels and the rest of his family were certain to have it well and truly whopped up them. Thinking on his feet, he had a brilliant idea. Aware that the crowd were now at the height of their sexual frenzy, he decided to offer his two teenage virgin daughters to them, as a way to satisfy their lust and to give the angels a chance to have a nice cup of tea and fill him in on just exactly what was on God's mind. The tremendous noise coming from the street told him that there were a lot of people outside, and so he calculated that even though there were only two girls, it would likely take quite some time for the whole group to work their way through them. He only hoped that everyone would form an orderly queue and keep the noise to a minimum. Quite how he managed to justify the reasonableness of the proposal is a real mystery. Yet according to the scriptures, this was indeed the plan of the only good man left in the city. One supposes that he thought along the lines of, well, whilst on the one hand they are my beloved daughters, virgins and pure of heart, on the other hand, they're only girls. And what with this being a message from God and all, well, you don't get many of those to the pound, do you? Fortunately, the need to sacrifice his family to the crowd never quite happened, and his daughters were able to save their virginity for a more important event a little while later. Let's face it, however, Lot did have the idea in the first place, and as we well know, as a man thinketh. The outcome was that Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed by a sulphurous attack from God. The only people spared were the righteous and faithful Lot, along with his family, who fled the city whilst it burned to the ground. Lot's wife, however, unsure about leaving behind the sex, fun and swinging parties, couldn't go without having just one last look, even though God had categorically said that they were to flee the city without looking back. Her punishment was as brutal as it was swift, and she was instantly turned into a pillar of salt, which Lot then popped into his saddlebag of his camel and used as a cooking aid for the next 30 years. Well, she was a big woman. Once at a safe distance from the falling sulphur, Lot and his two daughters set up camp and waited for further instructions from God. Only then did it dawn on them that the demise of Lot's wife had left the family in a sticky predicament. Now, as a widower, there was no chance of having a son to carry on the family line. In the face of this terrible situation, however, his two remarkably loyal daughters, who couldn't have been aware of what their dad had wanted to do to them earlier, got their heads together and formulated a plan. During the next 2 evenings, they plied Lot with sweet wine until he was drunk, as a skunk, and then they both had sex with him. The outcome of that union was that both daughters became pregnant by their own father and gave birth to 2 healthy boys. Satisfied now on a number of levels, Lot had 2 sons to carry on his name, and God poured favour upon him like a sweet-smelling balm of blessed oils on the head. So, upon examination, this story, purportedly inspired by God, lest we forget, not only includes but also condones sexism, chauvinism, rape, alcohol abuse, and incest, and yet more rape. In fact, rather than simply finding a new wife to help Lot continue his genetic line, apparently it was just as acceptable in the eyes of God for him to shag his daughters. What's even more interesting is that this kind of unchristian behaviour is found littered across the Old Testament, just as Mike and I discovered to our delight during those long hours at the Kingdom Hall. Thank you very much. There'll be more. I hope you enjoyed it.